The train rumbled across the American countryside, a long line of steel and wheels carrying men far from the battlefields of Europe. Inside, German soldiers sat in silence, their uniforms dusty, faces drawn with weariness and apprehension. Feldwebel Heinrich Bauer pressed his face to the narrow window, expecting to see a landscape of confinement, barbed wire, and the quiet despair of a prisoner's world. Instead, the first glimpse of America was startling. Rolling fields stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with small towns and distant factories that seemed almost ordinary to an untrained eye. But even in the calm, Bauer sensed something different, something immense and unyielding. As the train approached the freight yards of New Jersey, the faint clatter of wheels and distant whistles grew louder, mingling with the hum of industry. Bauer and his comrades watched in stunned silence as endless lines of flatcars came into view, each loaded with heavy machinery, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces. Sherman tanks gleamed in the afternoon sun, their turrets turning as if scanning the skies, and trucks, row upon row, were stacked in meticulous order, ready to move wherever war demanded. Mountains of coal and rubber loomed overhead, their sheer scale a silent testament to a nation prepared for total conflict. The soldiers had been trained to fight, to maneuver, to survive in the chaos of battle, but this was something entirely different. Here was not the unpredictability of combat, but the precision of a system functioning on a scale they had never imagined. American workers had built nearly 96,000 aircraft and over 2 million trucks by the end of the war. But in this moment, the numbers were more than statistics. They were an overwhelming physical presence, a forest of steel and rubber that seemed impossible to challenge. Bauer's chest tightened as he realized that the war he knew, the war of strategy, courage, and brute force, was only a part of the story. In these yards, victory was measured not in bullets or blood, but in the unrelenting rhythm of production, in the ability to feed, arm, and supply an army faster than any enemy could hope to counter. Around him, the other POWs murmured quietly, exchanging glances that betrayed the same mix of disbelief and dread. None of the propaganda they had absorbed back home had prepared them for this reality. The United States was not just a distant enemy, it was an unstoppable machine, capable of replacing losses, creating new weapons, and sustaining a war effort that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. As the train slowed, Bauer saw men working along the tracks, forklifts lifting crates taller than some buildings, and engineers checking manifests with meticulous care. Every movement spoke of order, efficiency, and purpose. It was a choreography of industry, and the German soldiers were mere witnesses to a power they could neither fight nor contain. In that instant, the illusion of control collapsed. Bauer understood that this was not the place to strike, not the place to maneuver, and not the place to hope for a traditional victory. Here, in the shadows of steel and smoke, the end of the war loomed, not in the thunder of guns, but in the quiet, relentless hum of factories and freight yards. The realization sank deep, a chilling awareness that sometimes the true battlefield is not where men meet in combat, but where resources, logistics, and the sheer weight of production decide the fate of nations. As the train pulled away, the POWs carried with them a memory that would never fade. The sight of tanks gleaming under the New Jersey sun, the endless rows of trucks stretching beyond sight, and the knowledge that they had glimpsed not just an enemy, but a force that could not be defeated through courage alone. In that fleeting journey through the freight yards, the war transformed in their minds from a contest of skill and valor to a reckoning with scale, efficiency, and inevitability. The lesson was clear. In the industrial heart of America, the end had already begun. The train came to a slow halt, and Bauer pressed his face closer to the window, his eyes widening at what lay before him. The New Jersey freight yard stretched like a city built for war, an ocean of steel and machinery that seemed to extend beyond the horizon. Flatcars lined the tracks as far as he could see, each one bearing the weight of Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks polished and stacked for deployment. The scale was unimaginable, even to men who had seen the devastation of the Eastern Front. For Bauer, it was not fear of firepower, but awe of sheer magnitude that held him silent. Men moved among the trains with precision, forklifts and cranes lifting crates taller than some buildings, while longshoremen guided massive engines onto waiting tracks. Each motion was deliberate, calculated, and purposeful, a rhythm of efficiency that seemed almost mechanical in its perfection. Piles of coal and rubber rose over 30 feet high, stacked in immense columns, feeding an industrial beast that never slept. The sun reflected off the polished steel of tanks and trucks, creating an almost surreal scene, as if a forest of metal had grown overnight. Bauer's hands tightened on the window frame, and for the first time he truly understood that war was not only fought on battlefields, but in factories, warehouses, and yards like this. The POWs had been told about America's industrial capacity, but seeing it was a different reality entirely. By 1943, the United States was producing nearly 96,000 aircraft, over 2.4 million trucks, and tens of thousands of tanks, far outstripping the output of Germany. Every piece of equipment, every crate of supplies, represented not just material, but power, organization, and a relentless momentum that no propaganda could conceal. Bauer felt a cold recognition settle over him. This was not just an enemy, this was an unstoppable system. It was not enough to fight courageously or outsmart the opponent. This was a war being waged with assembly lines, with planning, with the tireless energy of thousands of workers operating in perfect coordination. Voices and footsteps echoed across the yards as workers and engineers moved in a coordinated dance. Men shouted instructions, forklifts hummed, and cranes swung enormous crates into place. Bauer could see engineers checking manifests and organizing shipments for ports across the Atlantic, a logistical ballet that connected the factories of New Jersey to the battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. He imagined the ships that would carry this machinery, the planes that would transport men and supplies, and realized that no amount of strategy or courage could undo the raw force of production. Around him, his fellow POWs murmured, their expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet dread. Some shook their heads, muttering about the impossibility of competing with such a system. Others stared in stunned silence, unable to speak, as the magnitude of what they were seeing sank in. Bauer knew that for the first time, the war was no longer just a contest of armies. It was a demonstration of scale, of logistics, and of industrial will. Every truck, every tank, every crate of ammunition was a statement. The United States could replace what was lost faster than Germany could hope to destroy it. As the train moved slowly past endless rows of machinery, Bauer's mind began to churn. He recalled the losses his unit had suffered, the tanks destroyed in ambushes, the artillery shelled to ruin, and compared them to this overwhelming display. The contrast was staggering. Here, destruction could be replaced in days, perhaps even hours, while the German war machine struggled to maintain the same pace. It was a sobering thought, a lesson delivered not by bullets or bombs, but by the quiet, unstoppable accumulation of resources. By the time the train finally moved on, Bauer felt a profound shift in perception. The war he had known, the battles, the courage, the tactical victories, now seemed only part of a much larger picture. In the freight yards of New Jersey, he had witnessed the heart of American strength,
a relentless, organized, and industrially powerful nation capable of sustaining a war on a scale that Germany could not match. The realization weighed heavily on him. This was not an army to defeat in combat. It was a force to be respected, feared, and perhaps most chillingly, understood. For Bauer and the other POWs, the view of the freight yards was more than a glimpse of machinery. It was a revelation. The war was no longer about who could fight hardest or strike fastest. It was about who could produce, supply, and endure the longest. In that moment, amid the roar of engines and the clatter of steel, the illusion of victory slipped away. The end of the war, he realized, might already be written in the rhythm of American factories, in the rows of trucks and tanks that stretched beyond the horizon, and in the quiet certainty that industrial power, more than any soldier, could decide the fate of nations.
Bauer leaned back in his seat, the hum of the train beneath him almost drowned out by the thoughts racing through his mind. The freight yards had revealed something he had never truly considered. This war was not only fought with courage and strategy, but with logistics. Supplies, production, and the ability to move men and machines faster than the enemy could replace them were now the weapons that defined victory. The reality settled over him like a cold shadow. While German factories struggled to maintain output under constant bombardment and resource shortages, the Americans seemed to have tapped into a force that was limitless in scale and efficiency. Reports Bauer had once dismissed as propaganda now rang with truth. Declassified documents from the U.S. War Department, later released to historians, confirmed what he had sensed in the yards. By 1943, American factories were outproducing Nazi Germany by ratios as high as 10-to-1 in critical equipment. Every Sherman tank rolling past him, every artillery piece waiting to be shipped overseas, was part of a vast network that turned raw materials into weapons with astonishing speed. Aircraft production alone had reached nearly 96,000 units by war's end, while trucks and transport vehicles numbered in the millions. Each number was not abstract. It represented soldiers resupplied, battalions moved, and operations executed across continents with precision. As Bauer watched workers coordinating the loading and movement of heavy machinery, he realized that the war's outcome was no longer determined solely on the battlefield. Each crate of ammunition, every tank ready for deployment, was a cog in a machine so vast that it could absorb losses, adapt to challenges, and maintain relentless pressure. German victories on the front lines seemed increasingly fleeting when faced with a system that could replace men, material, and machines faster than they could be destroyed. It was not just an advantage, it was an overwhelming, almost cruel inevitability. He recalled the battles in Russia, the months spent trudging through mud and snow, the countless comrades lost to enemy fire and harsh winter conditions. Those experiences had taught him the value of tactics and courage, yet none of it had prepared him for the scale of American industrial power. Here, in these freight yards, the story of the war shifted from heroism to logistics, from bravery to production. The tanks and trucks were not just tools, they were the embodiment of a strategy that Germany could not match: fight and replenish at the same time, endlessly, without faltering. Around him, other POWs exchanged whispers, their voices carrying disbelief and unease. Some tried to calculate the numbers in their minds, failing to comprehend the magnitude. Thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of thousands of tons of coal and rubber, all coordinated, all moving in perfect harmony. The Americans had turned war into a science, a system of supply chains, factories, and schedules, where human valor played only a part in a much larger equation. Bauer thought of the soldiers he had fought alongside, their skill and bravery undeniable, yet ultimately limited by what their factories could provide. One victory could be erased by a lack of tanks, by empty ammunition stores, or by the slow, painstaking rebuild of destroyed equipment.
In contrast, what he had witnessed in the yards was the assurance that every loss would be met with replacement, every battle sustained by the invisible yet unstoppable machinery of industry. The war was no longer measured by frontline victories, but by the quiet, relentless output of production lines stretching from coast to coast. As the train began to move again, Bauer understood a chilling truth. The Germans were fighting a war already weighed against them by forces far beyond the battlefield. Courage, tactics, and even ingenuity were vital, yet insufficient when pitted against a nation that could marshal millions of workers, untold resources, and unmatched industrial scale. The realization left a hollow weight in his chest, a recognition that the final reckoning would not be decided in combat alone, but in the warehouses, factories, and freight yards of a country capable of turning ambition into inexhaustible power. In that moment, Bauer glimpsed the invisible battlefield of logistics, a force that dictated strategy, shaped victories, and ultimately determined the fate of nations. The war he had imagined as a clash of soldiers and weapons was now revealed as a war of machines, supply, and efficiency. The freight yards of New Jersey were no longer merely storage, they were a symbol, a stark reminder that the true end of any conflict could be written long before the first shot was fired, in the quiet, tireless rhythm of American industry.
The hum of the train faded into a tense silence as Bauer and the other prisoners sat, their eyes still fixed on the endless lines of tanks, trucks, and crates stretching beyond the horizon. Each man processed the scene differently, some in disbelief, some in quiet dread, and some with a creeping sense of inevitability. For Bauer, the realization was almost physical, a weight pressing on his chest. They had trained for battles, ambushes, and sieges, yet nothing in their experience could have prepared them for the scale of what they now faced. The war was not only being waged with guns and courage, it was being won in factories, warehouses, and freight yards they could barely comprehend. Whispers moved through the train car like a slow tide. "How can we compete with this?" one soldier murmured. Another shook his head, muttering about the impossibility of fighting a nation that could replace every loss 10 times over. The numbers that Bauer had once dismissed as exaggeration now manifested before him in concrete, tangible form. Thousands of tanks, millions of trucks, stockpiles of coal and rubber stacked higher than buildings. It was not an abstraction, not a report on a page, but a living, breathing reality that confronted them with every passing flatcar. For many POWs, the psychological impact was profound. Years of training, indoctrination, and belief in German supremacy collided with an undeniable truth. Courage and tactical skill could no longer guarantee victory. Even a brilliant commander, a flawless maneuver, or an inspired charge would ultimately be met by an endless flow of reinforcements, vehicles, and supplies. The realization that the enemy's strength extended far beyond what could be destroyed on a battlefield left a void of fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. Bauer looked around at his fellow soldiers. Some stared blankly, as if the magnitude of the yards had frozen their thoughts. Others whispered quietly, trying to calculate the scale in their minds, only to shake their heads in despair. Every POW felt the same chilling lesson. This was not merely a nation to fight. It was a machine, a system, and a force of nature. In the quiet of that train car, amidst the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, they faced a war they could not win through valor alone. The end, they sensed, was not coming in battle. It was already unfolding here, in the endless, organized might of American industry. The psychological weight grew heavier as they continued to pass the yards. Bauer imagined the ships in nearby ports waiting to carry this machinery across the Atlantic, the troops who would rely on these supplies, and the battles that would be waged with the vehicles and artillery they were witnessing. Every crate and tank was more than material. It was power, momentum, and inevitability. The soldiers understood, perhaps for the first time, that the war was not a series of isolated fights, but a contest of endurance, production, and resources. Their personal courage mattered less than the factories and freight yards they now observed. Stories from other POWs later described moments like this with the same tone of awe and fear. Some wrote that they felt as if they were looking at the future of the war unfold before their eyes, a future in which their homeland's efforts seemed small and fragile by comparison. The emotional impact was not just disappointment or defeat, it was the dawning awareness that the world they had known and the war they had believed they understood had shifted irrevocably. They had glimpsed the full scale of American might, and it was almost impossible to reconcile with the illusions of prior victories and pride. For Bauer, the human dimension of the experience was as striking as the physical. He felt a connection, however reluctant, to the laborers, engineers, and planners whose hands shaped the tide of war. They were invisible warriors, and their battlefield was one of efficiency and logistics rather than bullets. It was a lesson in humility, in awe, and in fear. The POWs realized that victory could not be measured by valor alone, but by the relentless ability to produce, supply, and sustain day after day, month after month. As the train moved past the final rows of tanks and trucks, Bauer's mind remained fixed on the lesson the yards had delivered. The war was no longer just about strategy or courage. It was about scale, endurance, and industrial will. The POWs carried a silent understanding. They had not merely glimpsed enemy machinery, they had confronted the human ingenuity, organization, and determination that could not be defeated on a battlefield. In that moment, the freight yards of New Jersey became more than a place. They became a symbol of inevitability, a reminder that sometimes the end of a war is not written with bullets, but with the tireless, unstoppable rhythm of human industry.
The train finally began to pull away from the sprawling freight yards, and Bauer sat back, letting his gaze linger on the endless lines of tanks, trucks, and crates. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the steel and concrete, but the impression of the yards lingered as vividly as ever. It was not just a memory of machinery, but of power, of scale, of a nation's ability to convert raw material into decisive force. In those moments, Bauer understood that the war was not merely a sequence of battles. It was a testament to human organization, ingenuity, and relentless determination. Every tank, every truck, every pile of coal or rubber represented a network of people, workers, engineers, and planners, all contributing to a single, unified purpose. The Americans had mastered the art of sustaining a war not only with courage or tactics, but with logistics, foresight, and unmatched industrial might. By the end of the war, the United States would have produced nearly 96,000 aircraft, more than 2.4 million trucks, and tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, numbers that were staggering, almost incomprehensible. For Bauer, the freight yards were a physical manifestation of those numbers, a concrete demonstration of what strategy alone could not achieve. As the landscape of New Jersey receded, Bauer reflected on the deeper lessons hidden within the scale of production. He thought of the soldiers he had fought alongside, the battles won and lost, and realized that courage and valor, while essential, could be overwhelmed by sheer capacity. The freight yards had revealed a truth that would echo through history. Wars are not only won in the chaos of combat, but in the quiet, tireless rhythms of factories, warehouses, and transport systems that ensure every front is supplied, every loss replaced, every plan sustained. For the POWs, the psychological imprint of the yards would last a lifetime.
They had glimpsed a force that transcended men and weapons, a force that combined human ingenuity, industrial precision, and logistical coordination into an unstoppable engine. Even in defeat, Bauer could not help but feel a grudging admiration for the scale and efficiency he had witnessed. It was a humbling lesson. The power of a nation is not measured only by the bravery of its soldiers, but by the ability to organize, produce, and sustain. The legacy of the freight yards extended beyond the war itself. Historians would later point to the industrial capacity of the United States as a decisive factor in World War II, a quiet yet unyielding battlefield that often outweighed tactical brilliance or battlefield heroics. The POWs, in their own way, had become witnesses to this truth. The tanks and trucks, the coal and rubber, were more than material. They were symbols of a nation capable of transforming ambition into action on a scale that few had ever imagined. Bauer thought of the soldiers still fighting overseas, of the battles yet to be won or lost, and understood that the war's outcome had already been influenced in these yards. Victory was being determined not only by strategy and courage, but by the ability to sustain, to endure, and to supply at a pace that the enemy could not match. The freight yards were a reminder that power could be built quietly, in silence, through the coordinated efforts of thousands, and that sometimes the true decisive moments of history were not on the front lines, but in the shadows of steel and smoke. As Bauer and his comrades were whisked further from the yards, Bauer closed his eyes and tried to absorb the lesson fully. The war was a tapestry woven from human courage, tactical brilliance, and industrial might. And in the freight yards of New Jersey, the POWs had seen a force so vast, so relentless, and so efficient that it had already begun to shape the end of a conflict they could no longer control. The war was far from over, but the path forward had been revealed. In the factories and yards of America, the end was already taking form, one tank, one truck, one crate at a time. Bauer and his comrades would carry this memory with them, a quiet understanding that battles could be fought, soldiers could fight bravely, and victories could be won, but ultimate power rested in the hands of those who could organize, produce, and sustain on a scale beyond imagination. In that sense, the freight yards were not just a place, they were a testament to what it meant to win a modern war, a reminder that the invisible forces behind the front lines often held the ultimate key to history's outcome.